Welcome, everybody, to NWCZradio.com, Channel 1's Down the Rabbit Hole. My name is Big D.
And I'm Brandon.
And, of course, it's great to have you along as a listener as well. We want to thank you very much for all the times you've spent with us, listening, being part of the big program, and emailing us at downtherh@protonmail.com, downtherh@protonmail.com. We love hearing from you guys. We love the conversations and all the requests and show topic mentions and everything. It's fantastic over there.
Yeah.
Before we get into today's topic, I just want to let you know that this is a two-parter, and we're dividing it up into these two sections because, A, it's a huge story. And I think it's important to always look into the history of things to set the stage. And in this story especially, we have to understand the key and central figure, who's Charles Manson, got to the point where we pick up next week, which is all the murders and how he manipulated all these people. But the story of Charles Manson himself, I think, has been misinterpreted, and I think in a lot of ways, if you read some of the books on him, mistaken in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have the hardest part about this is there was one narrative from mainly one main book for a long time, and everyone just took that book as fact. And I think as we've learned over time and people have been able to do more research, there's a lot of theories and ideas in that book of who Charles Manson is and who the family was that don't really add up.
They don't add up, and I think it's way worse than he portrayed in some ways, and in other ways, I think he gave credit to certain aspects of what was going on at the time that weren't deserved. And so we're going to explore a lot of that over the next two episodes. And I'll just say this. There is a ton of information, massive amounts of information out there about Charles Manson and about his family and about all the murders. There are movies, there's books, there's interviews. I mean, everybody who was anybody on TV has done an interview with Charles Manson because he loved publicity. He loved to be the center of attention. He loved to have his name out there. And you'll see that as we go through his early life up to the point where he started gathering this kooky band of characters that he called his family. But what we want to do is we're going to try to look at, I think, sort of more key elements of what made Charles Manson into what he became. Because it's a tragic tale. It's really a tragic tale about this guy. And in a lot of ways, I have empathy for how he got where I have no sympathy for him. He paved his own road. There's no doubt about it. And he was psychotic. He was mental. Yeah. He was out there. And he did it all pretty much to himself in the latter parts of his life. But in early parts of his life, if you were raised and you were brought up the way he was brought up, I have a hard time believing that this was all just one day he woke up and was like, I'm going to be a cult leader. This road was paved long ago.
It was paved long ago. And there's so many things that happen in his childhood where, you're seeing the things his mother did, his uncle did, everything else, the things that happened to him in these reform schools, in jail and everything else. He was, I think it's kind of a nature versus nurture thing almost in a way, would he become this bad if,
No way. I honestly believe that he was created.
Yes.
And I don't think intentionally, I don't think people intentionally said, hey, let's create a monster. But he may have been a little bit manipulative growing, I think there's some key aspect to him, but people can change. And if he had just been on a different course, he probably would have maybe grown out of a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of people who have gone through similar or maybe even worse situations who came out okay. They weren't unscathed or undamaged, but didn't take this turn, the turn that he took.
And I think it's one of those things too, is, I think he was made in many ways. And I think he couldn't, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think if his life had been different, I don't think we'd be having the story we're having now. I don't think we'd ever would have heard of him.
No, I don't think so either. I think there's a lot of Charles Mansons per se out there who don't cross the ultimate line that
Yeah.
he did. So let's get into it. And so that's sort of a precursor. If you know a lot about Charles Manson, I think we may cover some things that you might not have heard about, but I don't want to get a bunch of emails, people saying, wow, that's out there. Everybody knows that. Well, for me, yes. And for you, Brandon, you know, because Charles Manson, as a iconic figure and as a story figure and as somebody who's been studied, he's been a part of pop culture and news cycles my entire life. I've known about Charles Manson my entire life because when I was a kid, this is when all this stuff was going on.
Yeah. I mean, when it was one of those crazy things, I mean, it was before my time, but I mean, there was still the trials. There was all this stuff. I mean, what Squeaky did later was during my time, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I've known the name Manson and Squeaky and everything else most of my life. And if you get into this kind of stuff, this is normally one of the first stories that a lot of people find is the Charles Manson. I mean, I remember reading the Helter Skelter book when I was in junior high.
Yeah. So let's start with the beginning. Of course, Charles Manson, he was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a lady named Kathleen Maddox, and she was 16 years old. She was not married. That's how Charles Manson entered the world, and he didn't have a name. She did not name him.
No. I think one of the things I read said that it was a year.
Yeah, for a long time
his
on his birth certificate and all of his early documents, it's no name Maddox.
Yep.
Was what was officially put down there. Later on, when Manson was still really young, she married a guy named William Eugene Manson, and that's where he got basically his last name. Yeah. Although he really didn't even know the guy very well or even at all. His biological father was a guy named Colonel Walker Scott, and the only reason people knew that is because his mom filed a paternity suit against him. Charles Manson never met his biological father. There are rumors, a lot of rumors. I could not find anything that backed it up or substantiated it, but it's pretty much all over in stories about Charles Manson that this Colonel Scott was an African American. He was black.
Yeah.
Manson, of course, denies that emphatically because if you know the story later on, I mean, Manson was essentially trying to start race wars, and we'll get into that next week.
We will. I mean, it's one of those things that with him, the hard part is a lot of people, that's who she said she thinks was the father. But the problem was, I mean, she was a lady of the night. She was a sex worker. So who knows?
And she had no love for this child. She had no love for this baby that she had brought into the world. And so she would leave him. She would shop him around. There's a very famous story about how she traded him to this waitress for a pitcher of beer, and it was kind of seen as a joke, but it was actually taken serious at the time. It was one of those, I think the waitress said something like, "Oh, I'd love to have a child. I'd love to have a kid. You're so lucky." And his mom said, "Well, I'll give him to you for a pitcher of beer."
But I mean, they say it was kind of a joke or whatever, but her brother had to go find him.
Right? No, she did end up She did end up handing him off.
Yeah.
So what started out as a ha-ha moment ended up being an actual exchange, and she would do this, just leave him at places.
And it's one of those things. I mean, I hate to say this, but could you imagine how much different it would be if the brother never went to find him? Just said, "Okay, cool. I guess you traded him for a beer."
Probably would have been much better off.
I mean, like I said, we'd probably never be hearing this story.
No, there's a lot of moments like that in Manson's life where if it had zigged instead of zagged, we would have never heard of him.
Yeah, some other alternate universe, he was probably some car salesman from Cincinnati.
And according to Charles Manson himself, and he's repeated this over and over again in interviews, people around him when he would get vulnerable with his family or talk to friends, He only has, according to him, one good memory in his entire childhood. It was kind of bizarre. His mom and his brother, because they were poor and they kind of just moved around, didn't have a lot of money, and so they would rob and they would steal and they were manipulators as well. And they ended up going to jail because they robbed somebody with a bottle of ketchup. They pretended it was a gun. They had it in their pocket. Hey, we're going to, give us your money or whatever. And they went away. And when they got out of jail and reunited with Charles Manson, he claims that moment, there was about a week or two where everything seemed to be okay. He was kind of back with the people he knew, and that was the happiest memory he had as a child, which is extremely sad.
Yeah. I mean, horribly sad.
And, of course, by example, because this is what his mom did, this is what his brother did, he started doing it too. He was arrested many times as a kid for stealing bicycles and cars. There was famous, he went in, he would steal food from the stores, and then at one point he found a cigar box. I think it had like $100 in it, which was a lot at that time. And so he stole that, and then he ran away from home and he rented some rundown apartment in the seedy side of town and was just living on his own and buying food and going out and stealing other stuff.
And he was like 12
Yeah.
when he did this. We're not talking like a 19, 20-year-old, 15-year-old even. A 12-year-old just went and rented an apartment and was stealing and living. But that's like kind of what we talk about with the whole manipulation thing later. It was learned. He
Yes.
learned this as a survival technique from his mother and his uncle and everybody else, that the best way was to manipulate people to get what you wanted.
Oh, yeah. His whole life, he was in survival mode.
Yeah.
From the get-go.
Which is one of those things I don't want anyone to think that we're like defending him in any way. It's just you see the pattern.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is another story from his childhood, which I think points to the situation and where he was mentally and how he viewed the world and himself. According to this, Christmases were obviously super unhappy because they never had any money. And one year, the only present that he received, and I couldn't verify how old he was at this Christmas, but he received a hairbrush from his grandmother. That was his only gift for Christmas. On Christmas Day, all the kids are out in the neighborhood playing with all their toys and all their new stuff, and he went into basically a rage, and he gathered up all the neighborhood toys that he could, stacked them up with some wood, and lit them all on fire, just burned them up. So this is the mindset of this kid.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious that he was in and out of school. He would cut classes. He was not literate. He was actually illiterate. He could read a little bit, but he couldn't write. He wasn't a dumb person, but he wasn't overly bright either. He was like average. He was just an average person. He was just an average kid as far as his IQ. But again, I don't know how they came up with this because I never saw anything where they specifically tested him. And I think when they did was later on in life when he was in jail and he was an adult and they're trying to figure out, what's this guy? How did he manipulate all these people? But by then he was so burnt out on drugs and everything that his IQ level was probably lower than it had been ever.
Yeah.
So at one point, his mother sent him to this school for boys. It was a boarding school for delinquent kids. He would get beat there quite a bit. Once again, he went on a crime spree after he escaped from that boys' school. He got arrested, sent to Boys Town, which is famous. I don't even know if Boys Town exists anymore, but that was always, when I was a kid, that was the threat. Hey, you mess up, we're sending you to Boys Town.
Well, and what he talks about too is like these early like Boys Town and some of these places, going to these made every prison he went to afterwards seem like a paradise. Like they were that bad. Like, I mean, the guards would basically like molest the children. The guards would look the other way for other children, basically who were their snitches. That was one of their like, hey, here's what you get for being a snitch. I'll turn my head while you basically rape this other child. I mean, it's horrible. Like some of the stuff he talks about, in the interviews that he's done, where he's like, "Yeah, that was the worst place I've ever been. Every prison I ever went to after that was cake compared to that."
So he was initially at this Gibault School for Boys. Then he went to Boys Town. Then he was sent to the Indiana School for Boys. And then he was up in Washington for a while. He was incarcerated in L.A. These are all as basically either a kid or young adult, like teen. According to this one article I was reading, it said Indiana School for Boys. They regularly beat him. They instigated brutal gang rapes by other inmates. And they would, like you said, they would basically because they hated him. All the guards hated him. He hated them. They hated him. And so they set out to make his life a living hell. And so he kept running away. He kept trying to escape. And then they would catch him and they would send him back. He was eventually charged with a federal crime, sent to Washington, D.C. And by the age, this was a shocking statistic, by the age 32, when he hit his age 32, he had already spent half his life in prison.
Yeah.
Or reform school or boys school or whatever it was. In and out of this time, he got married twice. He had a son. That son later went on to commit suicide. Now, there's rumors that there's been others, but nothing confirmed. In fact, there was one guy who claimed that he would write Charles Manson in prison, and Charles was like, yeah, probably, I could be your dad. But when Manson eventually passed away, they did a DNA test, and it turned out he was not his father.
Is that the one that when the baby was born, he bit the umbilical cord?
Yes.
Yeah.
I did run across this as well. This was a famous quote from Charles Manson that those early days in those reform schools and boys schools and the juvenile delinquent centers and all that, they were so bad that when Charles Manson actually went to a prison, like when he was old enough to go to state prison and it was time for them to release him, he begged them to let him stay. He was begging the officers escorting him out, let me stay here. This is my home. I like it here. I don't want to go back out there. So that's a pretty bad situation in life when you think prison is the greatest thing you've had. It was, I assume, because there was structure, he could survive there. They fed him. He had a room. There was some basic, life necessities that were taken care of. And he, like you said, he was a survivor. His whole thing was surviving. So, and there's a lot of very credible stories that while he was in prison, he did anything, you can fill in the blanks there, anything to stay alive. He would volunteer himself to the roughest guy in the prison to be his friend, let's say, just so he had protection.
Yeah. Which is just, but I mean, it's horrible to say, but I mean, it's what he had to do.
Well, that's what he felt he had to do. Obviously, he at whatever point in his life decided that was how you survive. And if he was going to survive, he just did whatever he needed to. There was also a really bad situation where some part of his childhood, he was with his grandmother. Like I said, his mom would just leave him with everybody. And then there was a time where he was with his aunt and his uncle. And his aunt and uncle weren't much better than his mom. No. Not at all. They were tough. They were no nonsense. They didn't like him. Nobody liked him because he was psychotic. He was out of control. And nobody was offering any help per se. They were just trying to beat him down into being, quote, normal. Yeah. And there was a time when he was with this aunt and uncle that apparently he had cried in class. He was being, I'll just say right now, they're probably bullying him because he was really short. He was skinny. He was out of control. And so I assumed he was getting picked on. He cried in class. Well, his uncle caught wind of it and sent him to school in a dress.
Yeah.
So
Because he was going to act like a girl.
we're talking about in the 50s now, when that would have been the ultimate massive humiliation. We're not talking about now where we have all kind of anybody can do whatever they want. This was a very structured society back then.
Well, and I don't even think we're talking 50s. I think we're talking 40s, aren't we?
Probably. Yeah, it may have been. Yeah, it may have been like the mid 40s.
Yeah. Because I think he was born in 42. So we're talking mid 40s.
Yeah. Unbelievable. According to another report that I read, this was from one of the schools he went to, that young Charlie was not popular with his cousins or his classmates. So even his cousins at the school were ignoring him. They wanted nothing to do with him. He developed a reputation as a liar and a cheat who would try to blame others if he was caught doing something wrong, which a lot of people do that. But he reportedly learned early, this was according to the school reports, that if he acted crazy, he might create enough of a distraction that he could escape punishment.
Mm-hmm.
So these seeds were set early on. Distrust, lie, cheat, create distractions, act crazy, get out of any situation you can, blame others, manipulate others. I mean, all this was being ingrained in him. This is how he was viewing the world.
It really goes with the whole idea that the argument that you have all the time of nurture versus nature. I mean, he learned all of this. This was a learned thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there are cases where people are born that have some sort of brain anomaly or something that lends them to certain behaviors or whatever, that, and I don't know that. I'm saying it's probably a thing.
Yeah.
But what happened to him at a young age and the way he was brought up, I don't know that he could have turned out any other way unless he got major help or had some life-changing, life-altering moment where he either figured it out or he became a Christian or whatever it was. We've heard miraculous stories of people coming out of really terrible situations, but Charlie didn't.
No.
So he got married.
He never had a chance.
No, he didn't. He really didn't have a chance. He was married in 1955 to a Rosalie Willis. Then they had a son, Charles Manson Jr., but that guy committed suicide, like I said, in 1993. He got divorced in 58, and according to Manson's second wife, her name was Leona Ray Stevens, but he called her Candy. That they had another
weird names.
Yeah, I know. They had another son by the name of Charles Luther Manson. They were married in 59, divorced in 63. But according to records, this Charles Luther Manson is either a myth or just sort of disappeared and disassociated himself, and there's nothing is known about where this person is. There is a birth record, but again, nobody knows where this person is. So there's no way to do any kind of verifiable records on it.
Yeah.
The third son was allegedly Valentine Michael Manson, and he was born to Mary Bruner, who was one of the Manson family members. And apparently this person is still alive, but has gone into anonymity. Like I said, they all had sex with each other a lot.
I mean, wouldn't you go into anonymity too? Like, I don't want anyone to know that I have anything to do with this, these people. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there was Charles Roberts, who said that he thought Manson could be his biological father. It turns out DNA test that was false. So we don't know. So there's for sure one son who did commit suicide based on what his father had done.
Yeah.
And then the other ones are all sort of not verifiable, but there may be, look, here's the reality. There may be more out there.
Yeah, with how much he was doing and everything else, I can almost guarantee you there's more out there.
Yeah, because that was sex became his outlet,
Yeah.
and with anybody and everybody.
Yeah. I mean, and I think part of it was, I mean, like you said, for his first 32 years of life, more than half of that was spent in jail.
Yes.
So, I mean, I mean, not to sound bad, if I spend all that time in jail with a bunch of dudes, I'm going to be doing everything I can when I get out.
It's very common knowledge, and it's been done to death. His connection with the music scene, although we'll get more into some of the celebrities because he did have a celebrity list, and he did hang out with a lot of celebrities. It's really weird. We talk about connections on this show a lot. The paths of the people that he crossed, and the people who are famous, and some of their kids that he manipulated, almost brought into his family and so forth. That's a long list. But he was a musician. When he was in prison, he learned to play guitar and he learned to play a few things. He fancied himself a songwriter. And there's all kind of rumors out there. He never tried out for the Monkees. It's impossible because he was in jail at the time.
Yeah.
He did perform some songs for Neil Young, and that was at one of the Beach Boys' house. He did hang out with the Mamas and the Papas and a lot of their parties, and he did use that as a recruiting tool. He was this sort of whimsical, they called him a wizard or a fairy or a pixie, or like they had all different names for him. He was a 60s counterculture, hippie, revolution hanger-oner.
Yes.
Nobody really knew what he did. He sort of dabbled in this and that. He did fancy himself a musician. There were a couple of his songs that got recorded, but most of them way later, like by the artist Marilyn Manson and by a bunch of different artists who thought it'd be funny to record a song by Charles Manson.
Yeah.
But at the time, he was soundly rejected, and it pissed him off.
Oh, very much so. Very much. I mean, he was, and there's a lot of things, if you go with a lot of the stories where it seems so close, where he talked to people. I mean, he had a lot of, connections and people that he met, but were they really connections? Besides Dennis Wilson, he didn't really seem to have a lot of time spent. He just kind of met all of these people.
Yeah, he floated
And
in
that's
and out.
kind of, yeah.
He crossed paths with a lot of them. This is my opinion. Post The Big Story, when it became the whole cult and family and the murders, and it became sort of this Hollywood lore, it was weird to see a bunch of people who sort of kind of crossed paths with him come out and all claim to have, oh yeah, I knew Charlie. Oh yeah, I hung out at parties with these guys. And it's like, that is weird. Most people don't do that, but it did become kind of a cause celeb for a while.
Yeah. But it's one of those things. Think about any group that you've been in where there's always, I mean, there's people you meet and stuff like that. But I mean, I wouldn't say that they're, I know them, but I met them. And I think that was a lot of what happened with Charlie. He met a lot of people, but they didn't know him.
I don't think anybody really knew him. I don't even think the people who hung out with him, his family, so-called quote family, and on the inner circle, even they didn't know him.
Yeah,
but I'd say
I don't think Charlie knew him.
The closest that he got to any kind of music deal was, if anybody remembers Doris Day, she was a very famous actress and a singer. She had a son named Terry Melcher. Melcher did agree via a couple of the Beach Boys to listen to his stuff and to possibly record some stuff, but he soundly rejected him, and that's what set up. And we'll get more into that next week. That's what really set up and set him off. But
a little bit, yeah. There's that, but a lot of the stuff I read too, like they actually even went to like Dennis Wilson paid for them to like go to a recording studio. They went to a recording studio, but Charles Manson didn't know how to shut his mouth and listen to a producer on how to do anything. Like, nope, this is how I do it. I am Charlie. I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And that's where it all went bad.
I mean, there were a couple of other key influential things in Manson's life. One, while he was in prison, he read the famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yeah.
And apparently he studied it like the Bible and read it over and over. That's a Dale Carnegie course. If you're not familiar with it, it was very big in the 60s and 70s. Like if you were to be a successful salesperson or you were to be a successful business person and wanted to be successful in life, you were supposed to read this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And he took it all to heart.
Yeah.
But in a psychotic way, obviously.
Yes.
The other thing that he picked up in prison, because unlike today, when you went into prison, they wanted to know what your Christian faith was or what your religion was or whatever, because if something should happen or you needed help, and they wanted to bring in a priest or a pastor or a shaman, whatever it was, whatever your preferred religion was, they wanted to be able to assist you if you needed it. And he wrote down Scientology, and initially it was as a joke.
Initially, yes.
But he actually met a guy in prison who was a Scientologist, and so he started looking into it. And this guy was kind of coaching him, walking him through some of the books. And when he got out of that shift of prison, he went to a Scientology church, and I think he did I can't remember what they call it. It's programming, whatever their, where you go get tested and you go up.
Yeah, I can't remember. I know we've talked about it before, but I can't remember what they called it.
But he did it like 105 times.
Wow.
So it wasn't like it was just some sort of slight fly-by-night, oh yeah, I'm Scientologist, and then that was that. No. He got fully into it for quite a while. Then, as we're getting closer, and now as we're sort of moving into him being an adult, this is where he ended up in L.A. or down in the sort of went back and forth between L.A. and the Bay Area, the whole hippie movement up and down the coast of California.
Yeah.
And where he would run into all of these so-called celebrities or musicians. Some became quite famous, but it was a scene. I mean, he ran into Timothy Leary and hung out with him for a while. Learned to drop acid and LSD and all that stuff. But I found a list of people that he ran across, and I thought it was quite interesting. So I'm going to give you some of them, because some you will know, others you wouldn't know. The one that stuck out the most to me was Angela Lansbury. And if you don't know who she is, she was in the very famous TV show
Murder, She Wrote.
Yeah.
She's also the voice of Mrs. Potts in Beauty and the Beast.
Right. Well, according to very credible sources, and it's pretty well documented, that her daughter was named Deidre Lansbury. And Manson was just coming off, he was trying to woo Dean Martin's daughter, Deanna. But Dean Martin caught wind of it. He didn't like what was going on in this whole hippie culture thing. And so he basically said, no, you're not hanging out with him or any of these other freaks.
Yeah.
But Deidre Lansbury, she was really into Charles Manson for whatever reason. And she was young, very young. And she was having sex with Charlie, and she thought it was really cool because he was a vagabond and kind of counterculture and so forth. Well, he would pick her up after school, and with her mom's credit card, they would go on these massive spending sprees. Angela Lansbury eventually found out, and when that ended, when she took the credit cards and cut it off, Charlie Manson just he said, "I'm done. See you later."
Yeah.
So that's, to me, is really bizarre, that he had to pick her up at school, which means she was underage. And you will find this as a pattern. Charlie liked really young girls.
Yes.
In fact,
yes, he did.
In fact, several of the members of his, quote, family, he was having sex with them and inviting them in at as young as 14. There's another guy that he ran across in a kind of a weird way, and you want to see how connections work. This was a guy named Kenneth Anger. And if you don't know who Kenneth Anger is, Kenneth Anger was a very bizarre underground film producer, director. He was really into black magic and sadomasochism. You can still find him. Some of these weird, like Lucifer Rising. He wrote a book called Hollywood Babylon, if you've never read that. It's very sensational. It's all about the dark side of Hollywood, and a lot of it's been debunked, and he's been proven to be a bit of a liar in some of that. But Kenneth Anger, he was working on this film, and he hired this actor named Bobby Beausoleil. And Bobby Beausoleil was a really good-looking guy. He was looking to become an actor, and he was also a musician. And this Bobby Beausoleil was connected to Charles Manson. Charles, he never actually joined the family, but he hung out with Manson a lot.
Yeah.
And Manson, being the manipulator that he was, and being this little short, kind of scruffy, almost, he reminds, in his early days, when you see pictures of him with his scruffy hair and walking around, he looked like Animal from the Muppets, in my opinion.
I could see that. Yeah.
But
Definitely.
Bobby Beausoleil was good looking, and so Manson wanted to use Bobby Beausoleil to attract good looking girls into the family, so that they could all have sex with them and they could join the family, and they wanted good looking women.
Yeah.
Well, Bobby Beausoleil got fired from this film because Kenneth Anger was convinced he was stealing, and he thought he was trying to steal the film. And again, Kenneth Anger, again, strange guy. But the reason you have pop music and popular music and songs from the radio in films today is because of him. Martin Scorsese took a lot of what his filming style from this guy. So while this Kenneth Anger was crazy, he was nuts, and he was dark, he was apparently very talented. But here's the connection. Here's the weird connection. So you got Manson, Beausoleil, Anger. This is how they all roll. Well, this Kenneth Anger was really into Aleister Crowley. Very much so. And he saw Crowley as a prophet, and he really went whole hog into him. And he got introduced to the works of Aleister Crowley by a lady named Marjorie Cameron, who he claims was a good friend and a genuine witch, and she had what you'd call powers. Well, Marjorie Cameron was married to Jack Parsons.
Which is a name that comes up. I mean, we've talked about it before, how Parsons is just one of those people that, and why I even did the episode when I did it on Parsons, because he was just one of those names that kept coming up.
He shows up everywhere.
Yeah, he does.
And when Parsons died in 1952, Marjorie and Anger moved in together and basically studied sex magic.
Yeah.
And he said that the movie Lucifer Rising was a celebration of the beginning of the pagan age and the end of Christianity, where Lucifer was elevated from his place in Christian belief as a fallen angel to his pantheistic role as bringer of light. And where have we heard that before? Well, that comes straight out of the doctrine of Masonry. He also did a movie called Fireworks, which he made in 1947, which was, I mean, it got banned everywhere because it was this sort of homoerotic sadist fantasy that he had.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, he did Scorpio Rising, which is another weird one. Anyway, he did all kind of crazy stuff. So you see the mindset of these people that are all hanging out together. And you see how they cross paths. I said Neil Young, he crossed paths with Neil Young. Of course, Dennis Wilson. Dennis Wilson was the biggest one. And that's weird how Manson ended up in Wilson's home. Because Dennis Wilson was driving home one day and he saw two good-looking girls hitchhiking. Yep. So he gave them a ride to their place. And then, like, I don't know, it was a day or two later, he saw them hitchhiking again. So he picked them up, started talking, and said, well, why don't you come to my place? Turns out that they were two of Manson's followers. And when Wilson left the next day to go to the studio or wherever he went, he came back in the evening, and the entire family had moved in. And Manson meets him out in the driveway and says, "Hey, thanks. Yeah, we've actually met before, and you've invited me here before, so now we're here."
Yeah. And then they and it was one of those things, but I mean, I think Dennis Wilson, I mean, if you really look at the Beach Boys, he was the party one anyway. I mean, they were all partied, but Dennis was like and it sounds like at first he was like, whatever, there's women, there's drugs, let's have some fun. But they were there for a while.
Yeah, according to the timeline of that, they got a hold of Wilson's charge account. They ran up massive bills. The Beach Boy paid for all of the family's medical bills, which a lot of it was abortion and a lot of it was STDs.
Yeah, a lot of gonorrhea from what I kept. Yes. That's the word that kept popping up.
In just a few months, the Manson family had cost him over $100,000 and wrecked one of his Ferraris.
Yeah.
It was so bad that Dennis Wilson, and he was scared at this point of this crazy crew and of Manson, that he left. He just left his own house. He moved out.
Yeah.
The landlord of the house was basically forced to kick out Manson and his followers. And that was another thing that really pissed him off. In fact, Manson gave the property owner a bullet and said, "Give this to Wilson. He'll know what it means."
Yeah.
So
I guess Wilson liked to hitchhike too, because a lot of people talk about that's kind of where Tex comes in, which we'll talk about Tex later. He picked Wilson up while he was hitchhiking and brought him home. And of course, Manson and the people were there, and Tex just kind of fit right in.
Oh, yeah.
Which he, like I said, he'll come up quite a bit later.
Yeah, he was a very, very scary person. So was Susan Atkins. She was nuts as well. According to Susan Atkins, who was one of the family members, the family had created, quote, a celebrity death list. And on this death list, they were planning on killing Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Tom Jones, Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, among others. In fact, some people claim that Steve McQueen had been invited to Sharon Tate's house on the night of the killings, and they don't know who sent the invite.
Yeah.
Also, Peter Sellers, Kirk Douglas, Bruce Lee. And the reason they were pissed off at Bruce Lee, because there was a movie that was being filmed, and it was called The Wrecking Crew. Dean Martin and Sharon Tate were in it. They didn't know how to fight, so they brought in Bruce Lee. I can't remember what the connection is, but for some reason they were pissed at all of them. In fact, it got so weird. I thought this was just a side note. After the murders, because, Roman Polanski was married to Sharon Tate.
Yeah.
And after the killings, Polanski became incredibly paranoid, suspecting that his friends were also involved in the murder. He actually bugged their houses, checked friends' cars for bloodstains. But a weird thing happened. The cops found a pair of glasses at the crime scene. And so Polanski began checking all his friends' prescriptions. And he soon suspected that Lee was one part of the killings, Bruce Lee. Because Bruce Lee lost his glasses, he couldn't find it anywhere on the set. So Polanski took Bruce Lee to see an eye doctor and bought him a new pair of glasses just to see what kind that he wore, just to see if they were the same one, like if it was a fit.
Wow.
The eyeglasses that they found at the scene came from Charles Manson.
Doesn't surprise me.
Another weird thing, when you get more into modern stuff, Marilyn Manson, Brian Warner, the rocker Marilyn Manson.
Yep.
He would went on these long letter writing campaigns back and forth with Charles Manson, which is why he named himself Marilyn Manson.
Yeah.
Also, there was Cass Elliot and John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. In Papa John, which is the memoir of Phillips, he talks about his close friendship with Polanski and Tate, and then talks about how Manson would just show up at these parties, and they all knew him. Michael Caine had a run-in with him at one point. Of course, Timothy Leary, Frank and Gail Zappa. So that was weird to me. I did not know that. But apparently, Charles Manson's music was so weird, they brought Charlie to Laurel Canyon to Frank Zappa's home and had him play for Frank Zappa, thinking maybe Frank would like his music because Frank was known for some pretty out there weird stuff.
Yeah.
Then it got even weirder. According to the documentary Zappa, they had this open door policy. And a lot of people did back then, where people just came and went. It was sort of an artists, musicians community. I know this very similar kind of thing happened to John Fogerty. He ended up, all his stuff got stolen because he would just leave his house open and anybody could stop in and hang out whenever they wanted to. Well, Frank and Gail Zappa had the same thing, but they ended up having to close their doors right before the murders happened. And according to Gail, she said they had a run-in with their nearby neighbors, who she described as creepy. The Zappas then decided to sell their house and move out of the area entirely. Who were the creepy neighbors? The Manson family.
Yeah, I can see that.
I don't know if you know who Danny Trejo is. He's a famous actor.
Of course.
Yeah, well, he ran across Manson in jail. They were in jail together when they were younger.
Wow.
Henry Rollins. Apparently, Charles Manson had seen Henry Rollins on MTV, liked his work so much that he started corresponding, sending letters to Henry Rollins. And according to Rollins, he said, "We corresponded a few times in 1984. I'd just tell him about what we were doing with our new record, and he'd send back semi-lucid responses." He also says his letters would always have swastikas on them, so they were easy to spot.
Wow.
And it goes on.
He's a special one. Special.
Yeah. So before we get into, because we're going to have to close this up, and there's a lot of stuff out there.
Yes.
Feel free to go out there. But this, I think, is going to set us up for next week. And we're going to talk a lot about how he recruited the family, who the family members were, and what went down. And again, that's very well documented, but we're going to try really hard to find things out about it that are not as well known, and maybe attribute motive and some of the background story on his family members. But it is, for all his trouble and for, I'll just say, any empathy I have for young Charles Manson, when he decided to go full on Charles Manson and crazy and become a cult leader, I have no empathy or sympathy for anybody involved with him and those who chose to join him and all their behavior, because that they just went off the deep end.
Yeah.
And here's proof. Once he got his little inner circle of family, they had regiments daily, and this is where you get into mind control. In fact, I kind of skipped over it, but his connection to Timothy Leary is that Charles Manson would go to this LSD clinic that was run by Leary and another doctor, and that other doctor had been involved in the MK Ultra project. So we have that crossover. He learned all these things, so every day, every family member had to take what he called a sacrament of LSD. They were supposed to be loaded on LSD 24/7. That was his goal.
Yes. It was either LSD or belladonna.
Yes.
Those two.
At one point in 1971, one of his members, Brenda McCann, whose real name was Nancy Pittman, claims that Manson convinced him that he was God, and she testified in court that Manson had mystical powers, that he had breathed life into a dead bird, that he communicated with animals, and could read other family members' minds. So that's where he was at.
So just a little bit crazy.
Oh, yeah. At one point, one of the members of the family, this Sandra Good, was jailed in 1969 for credit card theft, and she was pregnant. I think she actually had the kid, but the baby had been taken away because she was in jail. So the members of the family were required to go daily for visitation with her and take turns nursing from her so that she could continue breastfeeding to keep the milk flow going. According to Sandy, she said it didn't seem unnatural to partake of the baby's food because we were helping her maintain nourishment for one of our own. Manson forced all the women to have sex with him and orchestrated family orgies. if you read the accounts of these are very strange. This is not like some triple X movie that, or like what you might think of as an orgy. They were very orchestrated, and he was in total control.
Yeah.
And he would sort of mix it up with these like breathing exercises and just how you took your clothes off ritual and so forth. And again, a lot of them were very young, 16, 14, 15. And then as it progressed, I assume because he was high out of his mind, and if somebody balked at what he was asking him to do, he would get violent. In fact, there was a family member explained in court, this lady named Linda Kasabian. She said one particular girl, I don't remember her name, was fairly young, maybe 16. She was shy and withdrawn. She was lying in the middle of the floor. Charlie took her clothes off, started making love to her. She resisted and finally bit him on the shoulder, and then he hit her in the face and brutally continued. Thinking was not allowed and was punishable by beating.
Well, if you can't think, because if you think, you just can't do that.
Yeah, according to many members, they said a one surefire way to get a beating from Manson was to appear to be in deep thought. According to him, this could lead to freedom, and he was not about that. He was paranoid, and so according to this, by 1969, he was beating him regularly. Like if you looked like you were daydreaming or off in thought, he would just randomly just start beating the crap out of you. He was also a pimp. He would pimp his girls out for all kind of stuff.
He wanted to be the best pimp.
Yeah.
That was his goal in life.
And the most famous was when they were living out at the Spawn Movie Ranch, which I've been to. I've been out there, seen what it looks like. There was the owner was this guy, George Spahn. He was older. He was like 80 years old. He was blind. And he just kind of let these hippies hang out there. Well, Manson went to Squeaky Fromm, Lynette Fromm, and said, "You're going to take care of him." And so she did. That was her job, was to take care of George.
There's I've heard different reports. Some say that she, he told her to. Other reports that I've actually read basically say that she was all for it, because if she serviced him and took care of him, that meant that she got to sleep in the house rather than one of the barracks where everybody else was.
Oh, yeah. She was happy she got chosen.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't, he didn't, he presented it to, Manson presented to her, say, hey, you need to do this for the family. And then she saw it as, oh, yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Because I don't have to sleep out here underneath, some tent on the sand.
Yeah.
According to a lot of things, and you talked about this, the umbilical cord, all females were encouraged to have kids. The group would give birth to the kid.
Yeah.
They couldn't go to the doctor. They were not supposed to go to the hospital. Any contact with the outside world was forbidden. And so, yeah, Manson's role was to basically cut the umbilical cord with his teeth, or on some, he would use a guitar string. So that was great.
Yeah.
They were also required to participate in what they called creepy crawls, which was basically home break-ins. He was preparing them for the apocalypse, and so he would send them out with knives and different, low-level weapons, not usually guns, and they would take random homes. And the crazy thing is they would go in and rearrange the furniture. He said this wasn't so much about stealing stuff, although they did. It was about destabilizing any feelings of safety and security.
Well, there was that. And then the weird thing was which we'll talk later too, is the race war, that he felt that if the race war happened, they were going to live underground until it was over with, and then they were going to pop out, and they had to learn to survive until the war was over.
Right. The women were supposed to be super thin by his decree, so a lot of them would just, like when they would eat, they would throw up. They would go throw up. They all had bulimia, unhealthy, and they would take massive drugs, so they would just stay rail thin. He liked them, like, if you remember Twiggy, back in the day, that was that look, super thin. Glasses, watches, and clocks, as well as books, all forbidden. You weren't supposed to read anything. You weren't supposed to know the time. Everything was supposed to be natural. It was like this natural view of the world, and you're supposed to go back to basically primal times because that's how man was intended to be. And then my favorite, this is my favorite of all, knowing what Charlie Manson became, knowing how he controlled these people, knowing how he wanted to be popular, he wanted to be big time, all of this stuff. The Manson family members were told to leave their egos at the door. Their past, their hang-ups, and their friends and families outside of the group no longer existed. According to Patricia Krenwinkel, she says, quote, I never ever developed a sense of who I was and where I was going and what I wanted to do. All I wanted to do was to please. I wanted to feel safe, to feel like someone was going to care for me, and I hadn't felt that from anyone else in my life, and apparently that's what Manson was good at, finding these lost, lonely girls who were really, really young, who had run away from home or left home and were seeking the hippie experience and the summer of love and the flower power and everything, and they were scared. They're in the great big world, and he would swoop in and just take over their lives and run them.
Yes.
But he had such a massive ego by this time, and the audacity of this guy who had been through everything he had been through to essentially turn it around and perpetrate it on others. But I guess in a sense it makes sense because he was just getting back.
Yeah.
And you can see that even still, like when they would go on those creepy crawls, his whole thing was, I'm going to make everybody feel extremely uncomfortable and not safe at all. I'm just going to rearrange your furniture. I'm going to rearrange your pictures. It's just, you'll know somebody was here.
Is creepy as hell. I mean, can you imagine coming home and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute. Why is my house different?
Yeah, especially if they didn't take anything. Because there were times they didn't.
Yeah, they wouldn't take it. They just rearrange. So you'd come home and be like, wait, what? What?
Yeah.
What? Yeah.
Yeah, but it would be very unsettling. You know,
Very unsettling.
And again, it was a different time. I was born in 1965. And so through my childhood, nobody locked their doors.
No.
You'd go to the neighbor's kid's house or your friend's house down the street or whatever. A lot of times you just walked right in. People, especially in the South, a lot of times, because there was no central air or anything really at that time for your average homeowner. People had their doors open, windows open. And so he saw this as the weak spot of society, and he decided, I'm getting back.
Yeah.
So that's a snapshot of how Charles Manson went from basically being born to becoming a monster.
Yeah. And he became a huge, I mean, but it's one of those things that, like, I think we'll get more into it next week, where I don't think I think people give him a lot more credit than he deserves. I think this was just chaos. I think Tex and Sadie both were huge pushers on this, and without their influence, I don't think it would have went to the level it did. I think he was just insane, random, along for the ride, and they pushed it to the next level, and he just went, well, I guess this is where we're going.
I think they were, and we'll see this next week. They were bent to violence and destruction, whereas Charlie liked to beat on a person.
Yes.
Who didn't obey his orders or didn't do what he wanted to do, and it was lashing out. But he did create the paranoia in them and created the situation that pushed them in that direction. And again, the end of the story is Charles Manson actually never killed anybody that we know of. There's rumors that he shot a guy in half, but nobody, and that he went and buried the body, but there's been no confirmation of that ever.
No. Yeah, there's been no proof that he ever actually participated in any of them. And like I said, I think it was just one of those things. He was trying to get to a certain place, and he needed these people to get there. And I think they started going in a way that he was just kind of like, okay, there's not much I can do about this. Let's see what happens.
So to wrap this episode up, what's your overall take on this aspect of Manson's life. Where do you fall in assessing and looking at from everything you've looked at, everything we've read? Like, I've never met Charles Manson. I only know what I've been told or what I've read or what I've seen in interviews. What's your assessment of him, and what's your overall feeling about Charles Manson up to this point?
Like I said, I think he was given credit for more than he should have. I don't think he did all the things that everyone thinks he did. Um, I think he was just along for the ride and basically trying to protect himself. And shit, kind of went wrong.
See, and I think I'm going to differ with you on that, because I think just from based on what I've read, and like I said, I have a lot of empathy for what he went through early on. It was a awful, awful existence, and nobody should be surprised in any way, shape, or form that it ended up bad. Just assessing it, when he discovered that he had some sort of ability and some sort of power and some sort of sway over these people and became a dictator, dictating their lives, dictating what they could and couldn't do. And he was sort of this, he saw himself as this master over them. He actually at one point believed he was Christ and Satan together, incarnate in one.
Yeah.
And that may have just been it could be all the drugs they were on. He wanted to be very philosophical. He would talk about Jim Morrison. He was very jealous of Jim Morrison's prose and his poetry and stuff, because Manson just didn't have that. But I do think that through all of his drug-addled mind and his control factor and everything, there did come a time, and I think we're right up to it in our presentation here, where he snapped, but he was so cunning, and he was so manipulative, and he was so good at what he was doing in controlling these people. I would guess that he actually knew what he was doing, and he was setting them up to get back at everybody for what he had done. He's like, look what I did, and you can't touch me for it.
Yeah.
But we'll never know. He's dead, and we can't get inside his head, and he was really good at that. He would not let anybody inside his head.
Yeah.
Just go back and watch Geraldo Rivera or Diane Sawyer, or there's a lot of people who have done interviews with him in jail, and none of it makes sense. He wouldn't answer questions. He would turn it around. He would always say, hey, what you see in me is what's in society. I'm just a mirror. You're looking at him. He was very good at that, and he was never really come out and get angry or get upset. He was a sociopath. There's no doubt.
Oh, very much so.
So anyway, that wraps it up for today. That's Charles Manson. And there's so much more. If you're interested, if you don't know this story, you should learn it. It was a very big part of world history, not just in America. It literally became the dark side story of the, quote, hippie movement. Summer of Love, Woodstock. This was the dark side of that.
Yeah.
For all the flower power and all the positives that people claim that came out of the 60s revolution, there was a really dark underbelly, and this is probably the most famous of that. There was a lot more, but this became the story. So
yes, very much so.
And it's where, culture crossed philosophy, cross the occult, cross music and movies, and it all sort of it all collided right here. And we'll get into that part of it next week.
Yeah, it's gonna be an interesting one. And the one thing to remember too, really, Charlie getting out of jail and then everything going completely wrong is about 18 months. Like all of this happens in like 18 months.
Yeah, it's a very short period of time. So we'll get into all that next week. I've got the midweek, and I have a special edition this week. I interviewed author and a blogger and a guy who's been around. I think he's written 22 or 24 books. His name is Mike King. He's written all about the New World Order. He's written several books on the Rothschilds. Very interesting guy, fascinating. He's going to challenge your thinking. And so I'm going to be putting that out there on Wednesday, and then we'll be back next week, and we'll talk about all the murders and the family and everything else involved in Charles Manson. So send us an email, downtherh@protonmail.com. Did you ever run into them? Were you around? Do you know anybody? Were your parents down there at the time? A lot of people claim to have been there, seen it, been around it. I'd be curious, your side of this story. So other than that, I'm Big D.
And I'm Brandon.
We're out of here.
See you later.